China just implemented its new ethnic unity law. Beijing sees it as a path toward further development. Western critics call it a crackdown on minority cultures. We'll discuss this and more on today's China Report. Welcome to the China Report. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. China has dispatched its first batch of emergency aid to earthquake-stricken Venezuela. 80 tons of relief aid arrived on Monday morning in Caracas, including generators, water purification units, and solar-powered lighting systems, alongside hundreds of disinfection machines and thousands of tents and blankets. This massive supply drop comes in addition to the $14.7 million in emergency assistance, which Beijing has pledged. China has also supplied satellite imagery of the disaster zone to assist Venezuelan authorities in assessing damage and to better coordinate rescue and relief efforts. As of July 8th, the confirmed death toll in Venezuela from the twin earthquakes is around 3,535, with an additional 16,740 people injured. Alibaba has officially banned its employees from using Anthropic's Claude code after security researchers discovered hidden code designed to secretly identify Chinese users. The tracking system, which operated silently since April, used steganography to alter date formats and Unicode characters in data sent back to Anthropic servers whenever a user's timecode or proxy indicated they were in China. While Anthropic claimed the mechanism was merely an experiment to prevent account abuse and protect its technology from industrial-scale distillation, Alibaba labeled the tool a high-risk software threat and ordered staff to transition to its own internal AI assistant. The controversy follows Anthropic's decision to send a letter to the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, accusing Alibaba of attempting to steal its AI capabilities through massive distillation attacks. Because Claude Code requires deep access to a developer's local file system, cybersecurity experts warn that Anthropic's hidden data tracking methods cross a critical line, raising intense cross-border compliance and security concerns. China just dropped a 5-year blueprint to radically overhaul life for its 85 million disabled citizens. The government aims to guarantee that 95% of its disabled population has medical insurance, ensure that 97% of school-age disabled children receive compulsory education, raise basic rehabilitation service coverage, and create 1 million new jobs. To pull this off, China's State Council is unleashing everything from AI and brain-computer interfaces to 100 new women's workshops and barrier-free upgrades at hospitals, banks, and museums. They'll also launch a landmark national disability survey, the first since 2006, to finally update its decades-old data. China has sent a second medical expert team to the Democratic Republic of Congo on Friday, following its first deployment in early June. The new team of epidemiologists, clinicians, and quarantine specialists aims to build on previous work by deepening exchanges with local authorities and international organizations, while tailoring tech cooperation to the DRC's urgent on-the-ground needs, according to China's foreign ministry. The crisis is accelerating. Since the Ebola outbreak was declared on May 15th, the country has reported over 1,700 confirmed cases and over 580 confirmed deaths. Yet Beijing isn't backing off. The foreign ministry pledged continued aid to African nations, vowing to help the continent crush the outbreak soon, even as the virus keeps spreading. China's new Ethnic Unity and Progress Promotion Law officially took effect last week, and it's already sparking fierce debate. On one side, Beijing says this law is about forging a shared national identity and ensuring no one is left behind in the country's modernization. On the other side, Western media and human rights groups have seized the opportunity to revive accusations of the government's forced assimilation of Uyghurs and Tibetans. So what's the real story? Joining us today to shed some light on the new ethnic unity law is Zoon Ahmed Khan. Zoon is an analyst and fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. Zoon, welcome back to the China Report.
Thank you so much. It's always a conversation I look forward to.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you back on. As I mentioned, this law was passed by the National People's Congress back in March as part of two sessions, adopted adopted through that and then officially implemented last week. Places like Tibet and Inner Mongolia have introduced measures to implement it already. If I'm not mistaken, this law kind of moves away from the previous Soviet model that China had, that they had adopted in 1949, where they gave a lot of these ethnic minority regions a degree of semi-autonomy. And now this law basically mandates Putonghua, or Standard Mandarin, as the primary language of instruction in schools, whereas like previously they were able to teach in their own native languages, formalizes that as the language of schools and state affairs. So I guess, what do we need to know about this ethnic unity law, and why are they implementing this now?
Okay, it's obviously a very big topic, but for the viewers, I think the first thing that I would recommend is go and read all of the clauses. Essentially, if you look into the clauses, they are about ensuring that ethnic minorities, and actually, if you look back at back in 1949, when the People's Republic of China was basically formed. Back then, there was a situation where even two districts were not able to speak the same language and talk to each other in many cases. So the standardization of Putonghua has been a process. And increasingly, as the country went through the first phase of reform and development, we saw the economy improved greatly, but inequality also was a part of that economic growth. And then since the 80s and 90s, there have been a lot of proactive efforts to make sure that certain groups that haven't been able to, let's say, economically progress just by the natural macroeconomic policies, there are more affirmative action policies in place to help them, come to a higher level, to basically address inequality. Now coming to a more recent phase of that, we call it second phase of reform and opening up, but also we know that this law, the way I look at it and the way a lot of people here are looking at it, is essentially about maximizing on the country's potential, number one, ensuring that ethnic groups, because there are so many different ethnic groups in China that have their own languages, their own subcultures. Even Han people have many different subcultures, actually. All of those are seen as equal, and that the country is doing enough to ensure that people with different languages, there's so many bilingual, trilingual communities in the country. Those children, those young people have the same opportunities in a country where actually Mandarin is the lingua franca. So coming back to the reform and opening up and addressing inequality, we know that 700 million people came out of poverty with the macroeconomic policies. And then since 2012, actually, a proactive effort was taken to in a targeted way, alleviate poverty in the 100 million people that were remaining. There were still almost 100 million people that were poor. And a lot of those people were actually in ethnic minority regions. And a lot of that had to do with, sometimes the kind of infrastructure in which they're living. We know that mountainous regions or some difficult terrains make it harder for communities to really be able to, focus on education or really be able to seek opportunities in the country at large. And the country, what China has essentially done in these years, apart from in a targeted way addressing that issue of extreme poverty, was build schools, build infrastructure, build housing communities for many of those ethnic minority groups, and also to teach standard Mandarin, because a lot of these children, a lot of the people from communities where Mandarin was not the main language, were simply not able to seek better opportunities, be competitive in a country where, again, standard Chinese Mandarin is the main language. So for China, especially if you look at it in the context of the 2035 goal, if you also look at it in the context of that the country is not getting any younger, it's really a moment to make sure that the talent of the country is, does not face barriers, systemic barriers, language barriers, infrastructure barriers. And if all children are taught no standard Mandarin, including also are taught their minority languages. Now, this is something that's also a misconception. In specific laws, the way China has invested in different ethnic languages, making sure not only that they don't die or they are not becoming irrelevant, but actually to make sure that the literature and the history and children are taught those languages, and you see people speaking in those languages. If you go into a region where there are ethnic minorities, that is a priority. They are to be respected. Diversity is China's strength. I mean, it could be a burden, it could be a strength, and China has strived to make it a strength. But at the same time, it is seen as the government's responsibility to ensure that children are not left behind because they don't have access to resources such as, instruction in Chinese, in Mandarin, in Putonghua, which essentially was serving as a barrier for them to be competitive with other people. So it's actually, I mean, if you look at it from a perspective of how many countries have communities that are unfortunately ghettoized because they don't have the same skill set as people born into the main official language of that country, then from that perspective, actually, this policy is helping address a lot of socioeconomic issues that could potentially, be serving as factors that continue to, let's say, and that continue to permeate the kind of inequality that was the case decades ago, years ago. So in order to address those issues of inequality, this law has been introduced. And also, if the viewers read the laws, there are specific clauses that say that actually official communication will also be done in those local languages, but the Mandarin version will be side by side. So it's anything but, erasing those languages. It's more about capacity building and focusing on children and people in communities where they don't have access to standard Mandarin because their ethnic languages were the main languages. They're able to be at a more equal level compared to many other in the country. I think the misunderstanding, if in my humble opinion, basically is caused by the fact that China is just seen in a certain light as a very authoritarian country that's trying to, force assimilation on these ethnic minority groups that somehow don't belong in the country. But actually, if you look at the reality of most Asian, even many African countries, I mean, we are multi-ethnic societies. And increasingly, what people, they're proud of speaking their own languages, but most people in many countries, developing countries, realize that they would want their children to be fluent in the language that gives them the most opportunities. And very few of those people will find the situation, this scenario, where the government is actively giving them that opportunity. So people speak very proudly. I mean, I've been to many of these regions, and they speak their native languages, their mother tongues, their ethnic languages very proudly, and they write in them. They're taught those languages as a subject. But to teach the main subjects in standard Mandarin, I mean, that's really what this law is essentially about.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're based in Beijing. I'm sure that you've gotten, a little bit of it, but I don't know if you've been following the US media coverage around this. Mm-hmm. There's been a little bit of a controversy since its introduction. So, media and human rights organizations, they've really seized upon this opportunity to revive these discussions of forced assimilation, of cultural genocide, especially as it pertains to Tibetans, and the Uyghurs, right? And they kind of cherry pick two articles within the law that I want to discuss with you. The first is what we've already been talking about, Article 15, which says, and this is a translation, this law mandates the use of Mandarin as the common language of instruction in schools, not only in schools, but standardizes it as the official language across state organs, public institutions, and social organizations. So I think, this narrative, it really resonates with people in the US because we're very familiar with the genocide of indigenous people. And so that's our natural point of reference. So we think this is a kind of cultural genocide. This is these schools that Uyghurs and Tibetans are put into. They're reminiscent of the colonial boarding schools that we're very familiar with. So I guess, I guess you've already responded, but how would you respond to that? Like, are they trying to erase these different kinds of ethnic minority identities in favor of one dominant single one that's imposed by the Communist Party of China?
I think, obviously that history of how ethnic community or in Americas, right, the indigenous groups were not just marginalized, ghettoized, and there were actual real genocides that are well documented today. Those languages have essentially died. And I think that context, given that for many people, that is the point of reference. This could seem like a situation where China is just superimposing a Han identity onto all ethnic groups. My response to that would be, again, look into the law, look into how much China has actively invested in not just preserving, but celebrating the languages that are part of the country at this point, right? So if you go to Tibet, if you go to Inner Mongolia, if you go to parts of Yunnan province, if you go to Xinjiang, you see that children are taught their languages. You see that there are entire communities of scholars, academics that have received funding from the government, from universities, to make sure that the knowledge, the history, the experience of those languages and those cultures is, again, preserved and well studied and well researched and well taught. You see Uyghur written everywhere in Xinjiang. You see even Tajik in parts of the region where there are more Tajik-speaking people, and so on and so forth. I personally know people from there are many other ethnic minorities, even in Xinjiang, that have very small population. And I personally know that many people from those ethnic minorities know family members who found research opportunities or were able to get many grants from the government to study those languages, which did not exist maybe a few years ago. Again, if you go to Yunnan, it's a multi-ethnic region. I was in Xinjiang just 3 years ago, and it was part of a poverty alleviation conference. And in Xinjiang, there are actually, if I'm not misquoting, 26 ethnic groups. All of them, you see those languages being spoken, and a lot of them are still alive because the government has invested in those. You see them in writing. You see children studying those languages. There's investment made in that. At the same time, if someone in Xinjiang, from a village, from a part of the country, wants to sell their agriculture products to the whole country of 1.4 billion people, they simply cannot do that as effectively if they cannot communicate as skillfully in Mandarin as someone who grew up in that language. So it's essentially, you look at the country's trajectory, priorities. This is a country big on numbers. This is a country big on economic progress, economic opportunity. People in China don't see this, ceiling above them, that their opportunities are not available to them. The whole country has simply transformed in 2 generations. And a big way to basically galvanize that is to ensure that more and more people from regions where standard Mandarin was maybe not accessible or they didn't grow up learning that language are able to.
I want to return to that point in just a minute, but I also want to discuss another article within the law that U.S. media has been cherry picking that I also think needs to be addressed, right? And that is the implications for its extraterritorial application. So Article 63 in the law says organizations and individuals outside the mainland territory of the PRC that commit acts aimed at the PRC that undermine ethnic unity and progress or create ethnic division are to be pursued for legal responsibility in accordance with law. So a lot of critics of this law are saying that the Chinese government could use this to target diaspora communities in the US that speak out against Beijing's policies. Richard Gere actually wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently discussing, its alleged implications for the Tibetan community and what it could mean. So I guess, how would you respond to these accusations?
This is, that aspect, I think, it really depends. I can understand, again, that especially Americans, they grow, there is a big focus on civil liberties, the ability to express. But we also see that being compromised when it comes to, look at the recent the genocide in Gaza or expressing their support for Iran, and look at how so many Russian and other international media were banned in the US, and students have been told to leave the country. Their green cards or legal statuses have been revoked. I mean, I think essentially, if you look at it from a historic perspective, China is not naive. Since the turn of the previous century, you had European colonizers using media propaganda in local languages in all of the colonized regions to create a sense of disunity, to change governments, to make populations, go in certain directions that suited them. And China is 100% the primary target of today, the Tibetan genocide or the Uyghur genocide, etc. I mean, the world actually by and large doesn't believe that narrative, but those organizations, those individuals still continue to spread that misinformation. So from a Chinese perspective, I think they just want to make it clear that this for us is intolerable, because this is a targeted campaign against the credibility of the country, against the unity of the country, against the progress of the country, and the targets they have set for themselves. The fact that there is a campaign against the country to discredit it, to disunite it, to break China. I mean, there are so many plans back in the early 90s up until now that have appeared where there were efforts to break the country. And so China is just not going to tolerate or accept those attempts anymore. And I think, Amanda, I think of course, we can look at things from an American perspective. And I think this perspective has influenced, dominated really the discourse, even in many developing countries. But if you objectively look at developing countries and if they study their own histories, they wish that in retrospect, they did not allow those external influences to sabotage their trajectories. And today, China is basically saying that. And I think increasingly more and more countries who were colonized, who were at the receiving end of coups, of government changes, of these so-called, color revolutions, in retrospect, they would have taken measures to ensure that wasn't done. And let me add to this. Did you remember? I mean, everyone remembers the TikTok trial, the demonization of TikTok. And everyone talked about, when Trump was elected the first time, that there was Russian influence, but they influence every country's discourse, politics in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom, as if they are the custodians of that. But if anyone, I was just yesterday, I have to mention this, we were in a room with a Nordic scholar. I don't want to name anyone, but he said that actually he was advised not to visit China frequently because he will be seen as a China spy. Individuals who don't demonize China are seen as a threat to national interests. This is the tolerance of that country that decides to dictate or to influence in a very obvious way how other countries should be governed, should pursue their systems. So that double standard is something which doesn't click, which has become increasingly unconvincing to people who've seen that interference. And now when they don't see themselves as the ones they see themselves on the receiving end, maybe they are completely intolerant. So I would say that those people criticizing China should actually look within the United States. What is happening to those who have ties or connections or just opinions with governments or on issues that don't completely align with what not even the people, but a certain class of the country wants to dictate?
No, absolutely. I agree. I do want to, like I said, the U.S. media is cherry picking one or two articles within this overall larger document. It's a document with, 5 or 6 different chapters and, 60 plus articles pertaining to, how to create this cohesive national identity for the sake of development, because that is what China is always thinking about, is modernization, as you mentioned, how to develop high quality productive forces and how to bring everyone into this development project so that everyone can share in this common prosperity. And the one chapter that all this media frenzy is overlooking is the one on what's called promoting common prosperity and development. And this new law cannot and should not be seen as something separate from modernization. China sees national and social cohesion as an important part of development, right? Beijing maintains that a shared standardized language, it gives greater access to economic upward mobility, as you said, and like better economic opportunities. And it's ironic, I think, that people in the States are saying that this is, overreach by the government, it's forced assimilation. But as it exists right now, without Mandarin being the standardized like primary language of instruction, there is a lot of inequality, especially in the ethnic minority areas, because they don't have that proficiency in Mandarin. So they have trouble taking the standardized national exams for college entry. They have trouble with their college applications and getting into universities. And they have trouble like getting good jobs because they just lack
just
that
being
proficiency.
Competitive overall. True.
And it's actually entrenching these inequalities and these divisions between the Han majority and these ethnic minorities. I'll
just quickly add a point that in a lot of countries with many ethnic groups or many different racial communities, right? I mean, you see that one specific community has stayed stagnated predominantly. And that results in a kind of, vicious cycle of stereotyping, of ghettoization, of, perceiving those people as something's inherently flawed with them. We know the kind of racism. It's intentional policy, or it's just the lack of, and keeping people divided along these racial or ethnic lines actually, unfortunately, has been used by many political campaigns and parties. China doesn't want any of that. They do not want an ethnic group to be seen in negative light by other ethnic groups. And there have been experiences in the countries, there have been regions which have faced like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization talks about, separatism, extremism, etc. And the countries across the world have faced this. They do not want those specific isolated experiences that an entire ethnic group or community should never be blamed for to become the basis to judge that community. What I think what a lot of Chinese people want increasingly is that anyone from any ethnic group, whether they're Tajik, whether they're Uyghur, whether they're Mongol, whether they're from Tibet, they have the same standing, the same percent. They're not discriminated against in any way, simply because you had a whole phase of the country's development where most of the people from that ethnic group were just not competitive enough. So the ghettoization of communities or division along ethnic lines, we have seen how that has impacted entire regions and countries. This is just not a country that wants to see any of that happen. And so, like you also mentioned, I mean, it's a very pragmatic, very economic, very logical decision. And it is a decision that can be made because China has the resources and the willingness to ensure that no community, language group, ethnic group is left behind, essentially. And how much the country has, I mean, I would recommend anyone to just watch documentaries, just travel to a province where they have multiple ethnic groups. Just go and see. And there are many places where you talk to local people. There's language translation apps. You don't need to speak the local language to communicate with local people. Just ask them how far they've come. Just ask them how different is life for them. And then go now then to ethnic groups in other countries, maybe many developed countries, that remain stereotyped for being lazy, for being not smart, for being radical for generations. That should not happen in any country. That shouldn't happen to any people anywhere in the world.
Yeah. Like we were talking about earlier, how in places like the US, there is a deliberate policy of segregation of, different racial and ethnic minorities. I just want to bring up that in this law itself, there is in the modernization section, there are articles that talk about deepening reform and opening up in these ethnic minority areas, accelerating the high development of these regions, strengthening basic infrastructure for transportation, energy, water, information, and logistics, to advance interconnectivity between all the regions. It talks about developing local economies. It talks about advancing construction of infrastructure and public services. So this is a major part of the law. So again, we cannot separate, as I said, and I keep mentioning US media and a lot of these celebrity activists, they are cherry picking a couple articles, but really removing it, disaggregating it from the larger picture, which is the modernization and development of China and common prosperity, which Beijing believes should be shared among everyone, not just the Han majority. But I wanted to mention also that, you've been to Xinjiang. So you've seen, I think, what the development of that region has looked like. You've also contested this narrative that there is a genocide going there, cultural or otherwise. I've seen you debate, analysts from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
You have? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I found it on YouTube. I saw it on YouTube. And they were like a major architect of this narrative. So I guess
Aspie, right?
Yeah, Aspie. I think maybe to end, could you discuss a little bit about, what the region has seen in the last few years?
I've been to Xinjiang a few times. I would love to go on a road trip and travel across. It's so big. I mean, it's actually, hard to talk about the entire province because I really wish I had seen more and more of it. But I've been to quite a few cities. And first of all, you hear when you go to a part of the province, of the region where there are more Uyghurs, you hear Uyghur all the time. Nobody raises their eyebrows. I'm just saying, I think one of the perceptions about China as the authoritarian, intolerant regime, as it has been stereotyped by a very small minority, but a dominant minority in the world, is that they think, these policymakers, these Han powerful policymakers of the Communist Party are just sitting there and saying, how can we crush people in the country? How can we exercise our power and control these people? But when you go to any part of the country, my God, Chinese people are very opinionated. They're very proud. They express themselves on social media constantly. They hold their local governments to a very high standard, whether it's someone sitting in Xinjiang as a Uyghur or a Tajik or sitting in Inner Mongolia. They're very aware of, and actually, a lot of the policy and reform coming every year, we have the 2 sessions and then you have the 5-year plans. A lot of that is based on public feedback, and that feedback is getting competitive and even more ambitious because they have seen their country change so much that they just hold their governments to a very high standard. So Chinese people are much more expressive, free. There's a high-speed railway system. They can go to any part of the country, pursue any kind of career they want. The Gaokao is a standard exam that puts everyone on a level playing field. And they just really want to achieve as much as possible. You look at a country where, still in many countries, right? Communities, simply because they're part of a certain ethnic group, etc., they're seen as they should remain in that. They're stereotyped. They have glass ceilings placed on them. And in China, there's none of that. And as I earlier mentioned, because macroeconomic policies cannot possibly, cover everyone. Very affirmative action and targeted policies have been part of the government's planning since the beginning of the first phase of reform and opening up to ensure that inequalities are minimized. And it is really the capability and the capacity of the government that has allowed different levels of reform and different levels of investment. Again, a lot has been invested in education, healthcare. What I've seen is houses, apartment buildings have been built for people who were living in mountainous regions, and because of that, they weren't able to earn a living or they weren't able to go to school. This is all part of a broader process of modernization. The best health facilities are provided. They have education, boarding schools, or just day schools for children as young as 3 years old. So that before they're 6, they're able to compete with children across the country. Children sitting in Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, etc., should have the same opportunities as the ones sitting in a small rural area. And that's going to be a process. We're not there yet. But I think broadly, I mean, when you look at how open and optimistic people are in the entire country from different ethnic groups, you've seen that their lives have changed a lot because of these policies. And they just expect more and more government reform to allow for that change to continue. It's going to be, with time, increasingly difficult to demonize China. And that is just where this is heading towards. It's going to be increasingly hard to say things about this country as authoritarian or intolerant when you see how the people are, the kinds of lives that they're living compared to their parents and their grandparents in any part of the country. You've only seen improvement. So I think that conversation, there's going to be maybe more investment in demonizing this country because it is seen as a systemic threat, as a rival. It's all geopolitics, essentially. But when it comes to hard evidence, it's becoming, nobody believes that there was, I don't know who believes that there was actually a genocide in Xinjiang when you actually have coverage of the genocide in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And you actually have evidence, video evidence. And so the double standard is just so glaring. And when you go to these regions, which anyone can, you can get a visa if you need. Many countries don't need. Just go to Xinjiang, go on a road trip, see for yourself. If you want to be on the right side of history, if you care so much about this cause, just go and see for yourself. And then, your opinion will definitely change. This kind of coverage doesn't really have a lot of credibility because of the double standard we all see.
Mm. No, I agree with you. Even with the coverage of this law, I've seen a lot of doubt surrounding it in the U.S. And I think you're right. Increasingly over time is going to be much more difficult as inequality as we see more and more inequality in the US, I think people are really opening their eyes to, this kind of coverage of China and what it serves in terms of the US propaganda. Like, why are we demonizing China? Are we doing it because to take attention off of, our own issues?
The domestic issues.
Domestic issues, exactly. Like how much money is being spent overseas on wars instead of on social programs at home. So I agree with you on that.
And
no, go ahead.
No, I mean, I just think, I think no one should. I do from my heart wish the US all the best. I mean, I think this is a country that has contributed a lot to the world. There's so much talent. So, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that this is the direction that people are going in, especially when they don't have access to better resources. So it's just a very unfortunate way that a country this country is being radicalized actively. I think what China is doing is an approach that could benefit more people in most countries. And you don't copy paste. I mean, you cannot copy paste a model, but it's worth looking into, how and why they prioritize and how they were able to achieve what they have. I think, we will be looking at this time very differently, maybe 20, 30 years from now, when historians choose to be more objective.
Well, Zoon, always great to have you. Maybe if people want to check out more of your work, you can let them know, how do we follow you?
Twitter and LinkedIn. And maybe Instagram if you also want to see more of my cat and my daughter.
Give them your handle so they can follow you.
Zoon Ahmed Khan.
Okay. All right.
I think that's my handle. Yeah.
On Instagram.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. And I think on Twitter as well. Yeah. X.
Okay. Well, I encourage everyone to follow your work. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.